Good morning and good afternoon. I want to thank everybody for joining today's conversation. I know we have those that are joining here in Washington, so good morning. It's a Monday morning, and those who are joining on the other side of the Atlantic, both in Kyiv, Brussels, and across Europe. On behalf of the Transatlantic Task Force on Ukraine, the German Marshall Fund of the United States, and the Reanimation Package of Reforms, we want to welcome you to this virtual webinar focused on rule of law, democracy, and anti-corruption reforms in Ukraine. My name is Jonathan Katz. I'm a senior fellow and director of democracy initiatives at the German Marshall Fund. I want to also join in thanking our speakers for today. We have really great set of speakers, real experts, and I want to also welcome my colleagues and partners, including in Brussels and Kyiv, for organizing this conversation. As many of you know, the Transatlantic Task Force on Ukraine has been led by the Reanimation Package of Reforms, RPR, and the German Marshall Fund of the United States. It was established in October of 2018 as a multifaceted platform for greater U.S., EU, and transatlantic engagement with the Ukrainian government, civil society, and other actors. So we really wanted to thank everybody for joining today for this conversation. I think, needless to say, as many of you know, the last several weeks has brought significant changes both in the United States in terms of new leadership, but also the challenges we're seeing on the ground in Ukraine. From even as of Friday last week at the Munich Security Conference, President Biden said that standing up for the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine remains a vital concern for the United States and our partners. We've heard statements over the last week from the G7 countries about Ukraine, not only support for Ukraine, but also urging Ukraine to carry out and address several key reforms that are critical to its engagement and next tranche of funding from the IMF. So a lot happening in terms of international engagement, concerns about the future of anti-corruption bodies, including NABU, concerns about continued judicial reform that are needed. And also on top of that is still the ongoing challenges by COVID-19. And of course, this is of critical importance to Ukraine, which has been hard hit like many other countries. So with that said, today's conversation is going to focus on those key reforms, excuse me, including in the media sector as well. It will also touch on the role of Parliament and the work that's being done on these reforms. And clearly, this is a moment in time with a new administration in Washington refocused on Ukraine to help Ukraine move forward on key reforms, support Ukrainian civil society's efforts. Today, we'll have several representatives from Ukrainian civil society, leading representatives, to talk about some of those challenges as well. So with that said, we have a really big agenda for the conversation today. We need to get to all of our speakers, which we're excited to hear from. And so with that said, I want to first turn to the co-chair of the Transatlantic Task Force on Ukraine, my colleague Oris Dechusky. Oris, can I send it to you to pick up and also maybe just to build on my initial comments? Oris, over to you.
Okay. Do you hear me?
Yes.
Oops, I'm sorry. Hold on a minute, please. Okay, sorry about that. Okay, thank you very much, Jonathan. Big thanks to Dennis and his team at RPR and Kyiv for putting this all together, and of course to our partners at the German Marshall Fund. A few brief points. One, there's a broad consensus here in Washington that the Biden administration offers not only a return to normality after the last 4 years, but also the prospects of an actually deepening U.S. Ukraine relations. President Biden himself knows Ukraine as no other U.S. president before him. He has a long-standing track record dating back not only as vice president, but even back to his Senate days. And those working on Ukraine in this administration, especially at the State Department, have a deep knowledge of Ukraine, one that I don't think I've ever seen before in all my years of working in Washington on issues pertaining to Ukraine. And this is especially the case at the State Department. It's still very early because it's only a month in, but we've already seen high-level phone calls with counterparts at DOD and the Secretary of State with Kuleba, expressions of commitment to Ukraine. Most recently, as Jonathan mentioned, President Biden at the Munich Security Conference. And importantly, Congress also continues its traditional strong support for Ukraine and on a bipartisan basis, notwithstanding all the events that surrounded the first impeachment. And both the new administration and Congress are fully cognizant of the dangers posed by Russia, not only for Ukraine, but for our own country and our allies and democratic partners. So I think there are grounds for optimism for renewed, definitely more vibrant U.S.-Ukraine partnership, but with a couple of caveats. One, this administration confronts a myriad of challenges, both domestically and internationally. So as important as Ukraine is, we have to recognize that there are many, many competing priorities. And second of all, the biggest obstacle to improved U.S.-Ukraine relations has been the lack of progress in rule of law and anti-corruption reforms. And yes, there have been important advances in the 7 years since the Maidan, whose anniversary we just commemorated in recent days, but also periods of stalling and backtracking. For example, many of us were disappointed by the removal of the reformist Honcharuk government nearly a year ago now. It seems that in recent weeks, while we're still seeing developments, as Jonathan indicated, that give considerable cause for concern, there also seem to be some positive steps, perhaps even of a more significant nature. So it really seems to be a mixed picture, at least from here, and to me, frankly, a little bit of a confusing picture. So the big question is, will we see forward movement in the coming weeks and months, or are the anti-reform forces still so powerful as to prevent meaningful change? Our distinguished speakers are as well positioned as anyone to help us sort out what's really going on today in Kyiv, and I thank them very much for participating and look forward to hearing from them. And with that, let me turn it over to Bruno Lette in Brussels. Bruno, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Orest. Thank you, Jonathan. And indeed, hello from Brussels. Very glad to be part of this conversation, as always. Also for this office here, the GMF Brussels office, Ukraine is a big priority. So again, thanks for including me in this conversation. And Ukraine, I would say here in Brussels, it still has a lot of attention. It remains a big item on the EU political agenda. And I would actually agree with my colleagues that Ukraine, there's opportunities for Ukraine to even become more and more a transatlantic issue where Europe and United States may cooperate. Again, I think that Ukraine, despite so much attention and energy going to the health crisis, the corona crisis, Ukraine is still firmly on the agenda because the EU has invested itself so much already since 2014 in trying to support Ukraine. Certainly when it comes to the mobilization of aid and grants, the EU is Ukraine's largest donor. So we really see that because of this, the EU is watching very closely what's happening. But there is hope, there's optimism, there's also a bit of concern, I would say. The fight against corruption remains a top priority for the EU. And these reforms are essential so that Ukraine, but most of all the Ukrainian people, can benefit of the EU-Ukraine Association Agreement and the deep and comprehensive free trade area. So those anti-corruption efforts really, are on top of the agenda. And I would say that the news where the IMF did not agree on automatically granting a new loan tranche, it didn't go unnoticed here in Brussels. Actually, it was news that was very well very well seen, very well noticed. So there's sometimes concern here that perhaps reforms are backsliding, especially in certain sectors such as justice. Very finally, I also want to, perhaps beyond the politics, I also want to mention that there's a lot of attention here in Brussels for also reforms in the business sectors and improving business and investment climate. It's a big priority. We're not always talking about that too often, but as long as international investors and also domestic investors in Ukraine are not feeling confident to enter the Ukrainian market, it will be very hard to boost the creation of jobs, to raise salaries and increase the overall prosperity of Ukraine. So that also is an aspect, I think, that in Brussels receive a lot of attention. And this is important because Ukraine is a country that is still facing some budgetary challenges and will likely continue to need some financial aid in the future as well. So that's my personal perspectives here briefly. Again, thrilled to be part of this discussion, looking forward to Q&A and to engage with you colleagues and the audience, of course, as well. So without much further ado, thank you, and over to my colleague, Dennis.
Thanks, Bruno. Thanks, Jonathan Norris, for your introduction remarks. And actually, you mentioned almost all of the topics we are going to cover today. And I would like to add about media. Media is now getting even a hotter topic by bearing in mind the recent sanctions and advocacy activities of the Ukrainian civil society to adopt the legislation on media. And media is definitely crucial in democratic development of Ukraine. Therefore, to summarize, our three major topics for today is to discuss the state of anti-corruption reform, which we have Olena Halushka joining us today, who is a board member of Anti-Corruption Action Center. We will discuss media reform from two different perspectives, from legislative perspective and political perspective. And we have Vadim Misky, who is program director of the Detector Media, and Igor Skladai, who is deputy director of Center for Democracy and the Rule of Law, to talk about media. And we also need to cover parliamentary perspective on all the mentioned reforms. And thanks for Andrius Achuk, who's a lawmaker, joining us from Parliament. He's a deputy chair of the Parliament Committee on Law Enforcement. And thanks to all the partners who are supporting this this event, and Transatlantic Task Force, the German Marshall Fund, the Black Sea Trust, and without your help, this task force would never exist. And thanks to all the attendees who joined us today. You can type your questions in chat, and we will highlight them, and then speakers will address all your questions during the Q&A session. Therefore, and as we're running out of time and have a lot of topics to discuss, I propose to listen to our first speaker today, who is Olena Halushka, a board member of Anti-Corruption Action Center. Olena.
Dear colleagues, hello. Thank you very much for inviting me to contribute to this very important discussion. In fact, we are very grateful to you for helping us to keep Ukrainian reforms agenda high on the agenda at the US, but also on the level of the European Union and other key important international partners. Actually, I will start a bit on building on what our distinguished moderators and specifically Orest mentioned, that basically these days we mark the 7th anniversary from the beginning of this post-Maidan reforms. And if I were to conclude and summarize the 7-year democratic transformation of Ukraine, I would say that Ukraine indeed achieved tremendous progress, but though that Ukrainian reforms do have a lot of friends, Ukrainian democratic transformation still has two very strong and powerful enemies, and these are Kremlin and oligarchs. And unfortunately, they are not only enemies, but they are also situational natural allies in making Ukraine fail. And basically, we are seeing their tandem behind most recent attempts to roll back and backslide Ukrainian reforms. If we analyze who stands behind the constitutional attack on the anti-corruption reform, and specifically the canceling of the e-declaration system, which happened late last year. These were the members of parliament close to oligarchs and the ones from the pro-Russian political parties. We've been witnessing over the last few years a very strong media campaign, which was disseminating anti-Western and anti-reform narratives. And this was especially well felt before the recent shutdown of the Medvedchuk's TV channels. We are also witnessing that members of parliament close to oligarchs and those acting as pro-Russian proxies, they are trying to water down the legislation, or they try to sponsor something which would really make the reforms impossible. And this year indeed is crucial for the anti-corruption reform, as a few milestone things are happening. First one, the head of the Specialized Anti-Corruption Prosecutor's Office resigned, and the competition for the new head is right now ongoing. Second, just last week, the Cabinet of Ministers submitted to the Parliament the draft law to fire Artem Sitnik. His tenure, by the way, is anyway finishing last year. So it's also important to make sure that the independence of the anti-corruption institutions and their sustainability are preserved. Following priorities remain urgent today more than ever. First, to protect anti-corruption infrastructure and to make it even more stronger. And the second, to finally have the judicial reform done. If we talk about this anti-corruption part of Ukrainian reforms, we should definitely start with NABU. And this is not a funny thing at all, but if we talk about something which is really the most sustainable in Ukrainian political culture and political tradition, this is the attempt to fire Sitnik. The attempts to dismiss NABU director started almost immediately after his appointment, and they just renew over and over again with the new tools, with the new instruments. On one hand, this is definitely a sign that NABU is the real threat for the corrupt elites, and they fight back and they try to discredit this institution. But on the other hand, this constant attacks, they really distract NABU from properly performing their work, investigating high-profile corruption cases. And just to talk about the latest attempt to get rid of Sitnik, this draft law, which was submitted last week, according to the media information, the pretext to dismiss NABU director was that allegedly NABU is to blame for the failure of the COVID vaccination in Ukraine. This is absolutely a manipulation. What NABU did was open up criminal proceeding upon the complaint, upon the crime notice, which was submitted by the State Enterprise Medical Procurement of Ukraine, who requested NABU to check the procurements regarding the Chinese vaccines late last year. Basically, NABU is obliged by the Criminal Procedure Code to trigger such a an investigation. This is not their own initiative. However, we see that there is a certain attempt to shift the blame on Sitnik for failed vaccination, and people close to president, specifically, like, for example, the deputy head of the president's office, Oleg Tatarov, who himself is the subject of the NABU investigation, they are definitely interested in killing two birds with one stone, to have somebody, a scapegoat for Ukraine being the only country in Europe who still hasn't launched the vaccination, and simultaneously get rid of Sitnik, whom they are really sick and tired. If we talk about this draft law, which is right now in the parliament, on one hand, it aims at firing Sitnik, but on the other hand, the wording of this draft law is so poor that if adopted, it would basically create the legal collision, because the Sitnik would not be fired, but the first deputy head of the NABU would be appointed as functioning, as acting NABU director. So in the end, the institution would be fully paralyzed, because it will have two heads and will not be able to basically operate. In addition, the draft law offers a very weak selection procedure, with the president having a very strong influence on it. So our solution is very simple, that this draft law should be turned down. The attempts to politically influence NABU should be stopped, and by the end, the tenure of NABU director expires, and this would be the April next year. The new draft law should be adopted, which would decide on the new appointment, on the new selection procedure, where the international partners should be granted the important, the crucial role, because that's something which worked well for the high anti-corruption court establishment. And this is the best practice, which should definitely be replicated to the other institutions as well. The next important development is the selection for the new head of the Specialized Anti-Corruption Prosecutor's Office. The competition is ongoing, and we have 170 candidates who applied to be the head of the SAPO. We have the selection panel, which consists of 11 people, 7 delegated by the parliament and 4 delegated by the Council of Prosecutors. The prosecutor is delegated for international partners, and international partners have the blocking minority right, meaning that for any decision to be passed, at least 2 international experts should vote in favor of that. So on one hand, this still helps to avoid appointment of the bad politically dependent candidates. But on the other hand, we've been seeing from the parliamentary quota a lot of roadblocks on the way of the selection. Like, for example, recently they tried to exclude the integrity out of the criteria for the new SAPO head, meaning that if not integrity is the criteria for the person who will be chief anti-corruption prosecutor, then what? Obviously, this SAPO head selections is a super important process, which should definitely be watched, because this SAPO development as well as NABU developments, these are something which would basically literally decide on the future of the anti-corruption fight for the next minimum 5 to 7 years. The last link in this chain of anti-corruption institutions is the High Anti-Corruption Court. Though we've seen a number of mistakes made by the anti-corruption judges, it wouldn't be exaggeration to say that it's the best court which we have in Ukraine, and it's definitely one of the most independent courts who ever tried high-profile corruption cases in the country. And recently, the anti-corruption judges applied to the High Council of Justice with a complaint about the influence which they are witnessing from the subjects of the cases they are considering. And the subjects are definitely very powerful people. But unfortunately, the High Council of Justice is not interested in protecting the anti-corruption judges. Instead, they recently passed the decision to which blamed anti-corruption judges for their violations. Obviously, all the anti-corruption judges should remember that their reputation is the reputation and the trust in the institution. So they should act without any questions, or their behavior could not be challenged by the people, because it's about the trust in the institution and the trust in the whole anti-corruption infrastructure. Also, late last year, we saw that the Constitutional Court of Ukraine fully destroyed the e-declaration system. Our legal experts tried to find the solutions on how the e-declaration system can be reinstated, and unfortunately it's impossible to reinstate it, because the Constitutional Court killed the very idea of disclosing of the information about the income and the assets of the public officials. That is why we consider that such a behavior of the Constitutional Court, it triggered the constitutional crisis in the country. And this constitutional crisis could and should be resolved only by restoring the trust in the Constitutional Court, which would basically mean reforming the Constitutional Court. The president even requested the Venice Commission's recommendations regarding how the Constitutional Court should be reformed, and received the advice that there should be independent panel established with the participation of international and civil society experts to pick new judges and to make sure that the composition of the court is renewed. However, last week's developments in the parliament showed that members of parliament are not interested in having the real constitutional reform, because they have appointed a new Constitutional Court judge without any competition and without the necessary screening. That is why the constitutional reform is still an important task, but it's not, I mean, we are not moving in the right direction with regards to that. In addition, the big roadblock and the big problem for the performing by the anti-corruption infrastructure is the work of the Prosecutor General of Ukraine. We've seen that she is blocking a number of investigations, like, for example, despite the anti-corruption court decision that the case against Deputy Director of the President's Office, Oleg Tatarov, should be transferred from the State Bureau of Investigations to the NABU, it is still lying in the State Bureau of Investigations and not investigated at all. Or there were also certain concerns with regards to the big case called Rotterdam Plus, where Akhmetov's DTEK is engaged, and the prosecutor is blocking the case, but she refuses to change the prosecutors and therefore to unblock this case for the proper and independent investigation. With regards to that, we still see that, as I've already mentioned, that one of the biggest challenge for the anti-corruption reform is also the judicial reform and non-reformed courts. And with regards to that, there are certain important tasks for the judicial reform, like, for example, reforming the judicial governance body called High Council of Justice, or reforming the Constitutional Court of Ukraine, or liquidation of the Kyiv District Administrative Court, which is a super dubious court that regularly violates its jurisdiction and basically stalls different parts of the anti-corruption reform, or even goes as far as ruling the evidence in the criminal cases conducted by NABU as invalid, which makes the criminal investigations significantly complicated. But if we talk about the High Council of Justice, this is the fundamental part of the judicial reform, and this is the priority for the IMF. This is also the priority for the J7 ambassadors, and the last year when they announced the priorities for their work, the reform of the High Council of Justice was put on the central place. Why it is so crucial? Because High Council of Justice, this is the judicial governance body, which decides on all of the appointments, dismissal, career issues, disciplinary issues inside the judiciary. And just a few days ago, we marked the 7th anniversary of the Revolution of Dignity. And unfortunately, I have to admit that almost no judges who persecuted Maidan activists were brought to responsibility for this grave violations. And High Council of Justice is that body which has to be blamed for the lack of responsibility for such judges. And the draft law, which was submitted by the President Zelensky to the Parliament, allegedly to reform the High Council of Justice, it is not ideal, and it won't ensure proper cleansing of the High Council of Justice. Neither it will ensure the effective appointment of the new members for the High Council of Justice, because our stance is that similarly to the competition for the High Anti-Corruption Court, the international experts that are to be part of this newly established agency to clean High Council of Justice and to be the selection panel for the new members of the High Council of Justice. So international partners who are part of this panel, they should have the crucial role as well, which unfortunately is not foreseen by the President Zelensky draft law. So to make the long story short, the High Council of Justice should be reformed as soon as possible with the support of the international partners and under the very close monitoring of the civil society and the reformist powers in the government and in the parliament. And should we start with this important step within the judiciary, it will help to clean the courts, as well as it will help to protect other parts, not only of the anti-corruption reform, because the Constitutional Court is the threat to the land reform, to the banking reform, to a lot of other healthcare reforms. And therefore, by reforming the judiciary, we will ensure sustainability in other spheres, as well as we will ensure that ordinary courts do not distract the work of NABU, SAPO, and Anti-Corruption Court, and allow them properly do their job. Probably.
Thank you, Elena. Thank you. Yes, I have one question for you, if you could briefly answer it, about the other crucial milestone in anti-corruption reform, which is anti-corruption strategy developed by National Agency of Corruption Prevention. And basically, its adoption in the first reading was very welcomed by civil society. Unfortunately, there is information that there is a huge battle now to preserve its key provisions. And what is happening with anti-corruption strategy, and what should be, which key points should be preserved there, in your opinion? And where do we need international partners to help civil society?
Yes, in fact, National Agency for Corruption Prevention, which was rebooted recently a year ago, it prepared and submitted to the Parliament quite a strong document, which reflects all the key priorities of the anti-corruption reform, real priorities. However, as you absolutely rightly mentioned, the members of Parliament flooded it with a lot of amendments before the second reading, most of which were aimed not at strengthening this document, but vice versa, on weakening it. And we've seen a few important blocks which need to be preserved in this anti-corruption strategy. First one, that's the judicial integrity. That's, as I mentioned, you know, on the example of the High Council of Justice, that's the fight where judges do not want to be brought to accountability for their misdeeds, for their illicit enrichment, they do not want to disclose the origins of their assets. And of course, obviously, they try to throw away from this anti-corruption strategy this big chapter on the on the integrity in the judiciary. Also, what is tried to be weakened up in it is also the part of on the anti-corruption bodies. And just an example that the strategy foresees that the audit for the NABU and SAPO should be conducted by the international experts, by people who actually have the experience in doing similar audits of the anti-corruption institutions. We do not have such experts here in Ukraine just because the institutions are very young, and therefore we do not have that much people experience to perform the audit properly and not to make the political conclusions which could later be used as the pretext to get rid of uncomfortable heads of these institutions. So this part of on the anti-corruption bodies should also be preserved. There are also some certain other fights for example, to weaken the role of the anti-monopoly committee, which could also be a very powerful body to be fighting against the oligarchic influence in Ukraine. Or there is an aim to weaken the corporate governance reform of the state-owned enterprises, which is also a fundamental issue with regards to state-owned enterprises reform, as corporate governance foresee the engagement of the very reputable international experts to the supervisory boards of the state-owned enterprises. So all these things, they should definitely be preserved, and international community, international partners should communicate those priorities with the leadership of the parliament to show that, to make sure that the anti-corruption strategy fully corresponds with the priorities of the G7, EU, IMF, and all other partners who are supporting Ukraine's democratic transformation.
Jonathan, please.
Yeah, first of all, I just wanted to jump in because I know that you have to actually go in just a little bit too. I know you have limited time today. And I just want to thank you. You ran through and highlighted several of the reforms, and I'm looking forward to our other speakers weighing in just a little bit to that as well. When you lay out all the things that you do, one, I wanted to thank you for reminding us of sort of these two twin problems of both Kremlin, Kremlin advocates within Ukraine that are have long been holding Ukraine back, but also oligarchs as well. And sort of this internal challenge, and the challenge is that when then Vice President Biden spoke in 2015 in the Rada, he talked directly about these same issues, about seizing the moment, not losing another opportunity. We're 7 years away from that. You're laying out a lot of the same, Oris mentioned some progress forward, but a lot of these challenges existed, many of them existed even previously. So when you're talking to the G7 or, and when civil society wants to raise sort of issues, what ones, what do you want from, what would you like to see from partners of Ukraine right now, given this moment, like the United States and EU and G7? And I think you laid out some, and the IMF, and you laid out all these priorities, but which ones should partners of Ukraine be pushing on right now? And I agree with you, particularly on NABU. And I will say this is not the first time that attacks have taken place or efforts to weaken it. I think any backtracking on that would have serious ramifications for Ukraine's relations with its partners, particularly with the IMF, but also with the US and the EU. But just tell us before I know you have to leave, but I want to make sure that people understand fully what civil society, and it's not just civil society, it's Ukrainians. You look at polling, still polling suggests overwhelmingly that Ukrainians want a strong democracy, want to combat corruption. 7 years after, I'm sure there's got to be some frustration with the lack of progress forward, but the obstacles that still seem to be the same obstacles that existed 7 years ago. So maybe you could just speak to that, because I think it's important, given the participants, to understand what you consider to be and others to be this priority, so we can really hone in on that.
Unfortunately, Jonathan, I cannot answer your question with one sentence, because these are two equal tasks. Obviously, we have to protect the anti-corruption institutions, and we have to make sure that the new SAPO head is the person of the best reputation, brilliant integrity, because it's about protecting those things that are already in place, and it's about allowing this anti-corruption institution infrastructure, which was built over the 7 years, to finally start delivering something which could be tangible by the ordinary Ukrainians. Because you're absolutely right that people keep saying that real fight against corruption is one of their top priorities. So people want justice. People want the oligarchs to be punished. People want corrupt officials to be punished. It would be impossible to do this if we lose at least one chain in this link of anti-corruption institutions. We've seen that we had the strong independent NABU, we had anti-corruption court established, but we had certain concerns with regards to the work of Nazar Holodnetsky, previous head of the Specialized Anti-Corruption Prosecutor's Office, and he created a lot of challenges on the way of NABU work. So it's important that the whole trio is working equally good. So it's important to protect this infrastructure, but simultaneously the judicial reform is fundamental to everything, because if we miss the momentum to reboot the High Council of Justice and to ensure that judicial governance body is staffed with people who are really aimed at cleansing the courts, then we will always have this, Damocles sword of non-reformed courts, which will be hanging over everything, any reform in that country. So unfortunately, I cannot say that this institution is fundamental and all the others are not. That it's about such a complex issue with all of the things equally important.
Do you think, though, that the IMF should add some additional conditionality, laying this out more specifically? Because I think it's less clear if they include all of these things in it. And I'm curious if you think that would be helpful, is to have a more definitive inclusion of these things spelt out by the IMF and the US and EU. Because I get a sense too that maybe perhaps this is my observation of the last 4 years in the Trump administration, is that reforms were not a priority. Democratic reforms were not a top line White House priority. Whereas with this incoming administration, the Biden administration, democracy, rule of law, combating corruption is a top priority. The president has spoken about this. And I think that this same line of combating these issues and addressing them is also shared in Brussels too, which is in some senses been out there speaking about this for the last several years, but maybe didn't have a U.S. partner. So I just wanted to know conditionality. Would you want that conditionality to be strengthened?
Well, I think that at least based on the statements which were issued after the IMF mission left Ukraine, well, virtually left Ukraine, they made their priorities quite well with regards to the judicial reform, not like generally do the judicial reform, but they were very specific with regards to High Council of Justice. They were quite specific with regards to NABU. So I think that international partners are doing a good job with regards to conditioning this reforms, and this is indeed very helpful. But if we talk about the international partners' role, we shouldn't forget about this second challenge, which I mentioned at the very beginning, Kremlin, because these are simultaneously two wars, two fights on the internal and on the external front line. And we really need international partners, more active and more proactive participation with regards to combating Russian influence, because we've seen recently that some issues, like, for example, last year's comeback of the Russian delegation in the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe amidst very huge massive violations of the human rights in Moscow. These things, they send a very bad signal to Kremlin that the international partners are ready to build bridges despite Putin's Russia continue violating international law, sovereignty of countries like Ukraine, Moldova, and Georgia. So we really need to help to get the help on this both fronts.
Yeah, I think that's been pretty clear from at least in the new administration about a focus on the Kremlin's role. And I share your regret about Russia rejoining. The Navalny case in particular, to me, stands out. How can you allow a country to move forward, one which tries to assassinate political opponents? I know that's not the conversation today, but I think there's a lot of ears in Washington listening. I can say the same in Brussels about the role of the Kremlin and Russia right now. And I will pledge to you that the Transatlantic Task Force on Ukraine and colleagues who are on here will be focusing on this, but plus Minsk as well, and the importance of these political solutions and security of Ukraine, because as you said, there's twin challenges, and I think Ukraine has always faced that. I'd add COVID as maybe a third challenge, and that we'll be picking up on that as well. So I don't want to monopolize the time, but I know that what you have said lays out really a very an important agenda of issues that need to be on the front line of the conversations between U.S., EU, and Ukrainian officials.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Elena, for joining us, and thank you, Jonathan, for your remarks and questions. As Elena mentioned, media is a tool often used for to oppose the reforms. Unfortunately, the ownership of media in Ukraine is basically can be characterized as the ownership of oligarchs. At the same time, media is a tool Russia uses in Ukraine. And basically, we have our next speaker, who is Vadim Isky, who is the program director of the Detector Media. Vadim, could you please tell us a brief overview of what is going on in media?
Thank you so much, Denise, and thank you for inviting to participate in such an important discussion. I'd like to highlight two things today. First is sanctions against Medvedchuk's media, 3 TV channels, and future steps needed, and also about the public broadcasting, which, as you know, in 2 months will have the first time in its history of operation changing the CEO. First of all, about the sanctions against Medvedchuk's. Sometimes we hear from abroad that sanctions applied against Medvedchuk's channels can undermine the freedom of speech. But Ukrainian civil society has widely supported these sanctions. Statements in support of the sanctions made by media movement community, the Independent Media Council, and a number of civil society organizations. Detector Media Monitorings show that these TV channels have serious problems with freedom of speech, and also they support Russian aggression in Ukraine. First of all, there was actually no freedom of speech on these channels. Their anchors worked in the interests of the opposition platform for Life party. One of the heads of this party is Viktor Medvedchuk, and literally these anchors of this channel said on air that they are working in the interests of party. For example, Vyacheslav Pekhovshik, one of the presenters of these channels, said, "I'm working to ensure that the opposition platform for Life achieves maximum electoral success." So this means they never have been free. In addition, the lack of freedom of speech was also the part of their editorial policy. For example, Zik TV channel have been silent for more than 4 days about the protests in Belarus after they started. Also, in the end of January, Medvedchuk's channels didn't mention at all Alexei Navalny's investigation about the Putin Palace. The second point is the Medvedchuk channel supported Russian aggression in Ukraine. They justified annexation of Crimea, directly blamed Ukraine in the war in Donbass. At the same time, Russian-led terrorists in Donbass were glorified and they tried to give them subjectivity. For example, ex-Ministry of Justice of Ukraine in the government of Yanukovych called these terrorist groups in the air of Medvedchuk channels the Donbass which not surrendered. Over the past 5 years, Detector Media has written hundreds of analytical and monitoring pieces featuring Medvedchuk's media. We've made talk shows monitorings, news monitoring, disinformation reviews, and others. You can open any of these texts at random and make sure that these channels are not about journalism and freedom of speech. These are outlets that are responsible for more than 50% of Russian disinformation in Ukraine. It's also a calculation, not just a good word. But the reason for the sanction was not the conflict, because this should do the media regulator, not the National Security Council. The media regulator, if it decides to revoke the licenses, it can be challenged in the court for a long time. And the real reason was financing these channels by the firms from the part of Donbass occupied by terrorists. So actually their journalistic work was never limited. The main reason was their ties with terrorists. But also, you know that in 2014, the US imposed sanctions against Viktor Medvedchuk for his role in actions or policies that threaten the peace, security, stability, sovereignty, and territorial integrity of Ukraine, as well as his role in actions or policies that undermine democratic processes or institutions in Ukraine. Since that time, Viktor Medvedchuk has attempted to bypass US sanctions while conducting of his financial operations through companies registered for his wife, Oksana Marchenko, or associates and proxies such as Taras Kozak, who owned the channels. We believe that Viktor Medvedchuk knowingly bypassed these sanctions imposed by US government. By doing this, he not only gained significant profits, but also undermined the authority of US sanctions regime by showing that sanctions are not an obstacle for running a business or conducting successful operations with US entities. Therefore, we Detector Media, together with Anti-Corruption Action Center and 15 prominent Ukrainian civil society organizations, asked to ensure enforcement of US sanctions against Viktor Medvedchuk by including his wife Oksana Marchenko and his close associate Taras Kozak, as well as the companies controlled by them, to the OFAC list. This will significantly weaken Russian agents in Ukraine by stopping the flow of dirty Russian money to their destructive project and anti-democratic propaganda outlets. The second point I wanted to talk about is a public broadcasting, or we call it Suspilne in Ukraine. You know, it exists since 2017, and it was created on the basis of 30 state-owned TV and radio companies. It's a big machine, big structure. It has national channels, regional channels, and since last year it has also a very efficient digital department with websites. In recent years, you might hear a lot of criticism on the public broadcasting because the low ratings of its TV channels. At the same time, in public broadcasting, we have the most popular information radio station in the country, the Ukrainian radio, the very powerful digital department, which produce information content for site and social networks. And after reorganization of board we made in 2019, last year, TV channels audience also finally began to grow. But we have a problem with the capacity of public broadcasting to operate. It's now threatened. The reason is unstable funding model of the company, which allows the government and the parliament to make a political decision on the side of public broadcasting budget every year instead of automatic calculation based on formula. The main problem is the capacity that this unstable funding model actually can undermine the capacity to operate and to plan activities of public broadcasting, plan its development for the nearest future. Here is very important that Ukrainian partners, including the United States, continue to push for adoption the new funding model for public broadcasting. It was developed a long time ago and will allow to move from the survival mode to development of the company. But the main issue about the public broadcasting is the first time after its creation we will have reboot of its governing bodies. In the January, actually in February, we have rebooted the supervisory board, the governing body, which in the next step will elect the CEO of the company. And politicians are already showing a lot of interest in members of supervisory board, because in 2 months we will have elections of the new CEO. We expect that these elections will be hot, and the ruling party will want to put their CEO there. And it is very important for international partners to pay attention and remind the government and the president office that interfering in the work of independent public broadcasting is illegal and unacceptable in the democratic society. That's all I wanted to say, and also will be glad to answer your questions.
Thank you, Vadim. And basically, I propose to have our next speaker on media and collect questions and unite them for both speakers. The next speaker is Igor Skladai, who is the Deputy Director at the Center for Democracy and Rule of Law. And Igor, you're one of the key experts to actually draft the new media legislation in the parliament, and could you please briefly describe what is this legislation is about, and actually just for our audience to know why it is important. Civil society advocates this legislation for years, and we observe very strong opposition from oligarchs to actually adopt it. Igor, the floor is yours.
Good afternoon. Do you hear me? Is it okay? Okay.
Yes.
Thank you for inviting me here. I will try to briefly explain what's going on. Today is a very interesting day. 20 years ago was enacted the first law on TV and radio broadcasting. It was 1993 law developed for 2 years, and it was enforcement just day by day 28 years ago. Since that time, this law was changed with numerous small amendments. In 2006, it was changed from 50 articles to 75 articles, and plus we have separate law on National Council on TV and radio broadcasting. But despite of these all events, this law at 2006 was already outdated. One of the reasons because we absolutely failed normal process of digital transformation. I mean, transforming under the agreement of International Telecommunication Union called Geneva 2006, which obliged all countries in Europe and not only in Europe to change it analog broadcasting terrestrial to digital one. Ukraine made it in very specific way, and it's again very great example what corruption can do because it was untransparent. We have untransparent, frankly speaking, monopoly operator, and still we have not covered country as it wished by a lot of media experts. It's a first problem. Second problem, we have the weakest regulator in Europe. Our regulators since 2015 had no good mechanism for sanctioning broadcasters for different type of violation, especially for violations related to minors, minorities, hate speech, and so on and so on. It was quite rare, and mostly if some cases happened, it was more political motivated, like we can recall a case of Fifth Channel during Orange Revolution in 2004-05. We can recall a case of Chernomorka also at another election campaign, but in general, it was quite ineffective. In 2015, happily, we got first time that they can use penalties, but as Vadim previously mentioned, in court, these penalties broken, even if it was absolutely clear case for media experts, like violation of, it was a program which really affect children, and National Council used sanction for 1 million hryvnias, but then they go to court and this case was absolutely destroyed. And that's a case, this shows that our mechanism is not effective. We need to change it. We need to empower our regulator, and this is a cause to problem. Well, first of all, that market don't want to have a powerful regulator because they understand that it will cause some sanctions, at least sanctions. From another side, we understand that this, like we called it, phantom pain from previous times, and market, and not only market, also not believe in regulator because they understand that it could be politically motivated. And that's a case, in general, that's a case of trust. And I remember someone from participants asked on the presentation of Olena Halushka, what's going on, why 7 years we lost. I could say that the main maybe problem, it's not about drafts, it's not about some even current political agenda, it's more deepest problems starting from trust in society. It's problems related to post-communism traumas, which we, unfortunately, we all, even we younger people, we still affected. And that's why it's very difficult to build reform quickly, because not because of lack of great experts in different areas, but because of some more deep problems related to society per se. As for media law, this draft started developed in 2012 as draft law on audiovisual media services, because on that time we understand that the law on TV and radio broadcasting was outdated. And later this draft was 2 times transformed, and finally in 2019, when new parliament came into force, new humanitarian committee, they asked to continue this job, and this draft was transformed from draft law on media services, audiovisual media services, to draft on law media, which means that this draft must incorporate also law on press. It must dismiss law on informational agency because there is no sense of this law at all, and some law on National Council on TV and Radio, and some other laws. It's also like enforce this recommendation of our experts from Council of Europe, which recommend us to decrease number of legal acts which regulate in media sphere. And it's not a code, but it's like some type of incorporation of different acts. And this law changing, first of all, system of licensing. It leaves licensing only for terrestrial broadcasting. All other types, it's a document like registration. Second novelty, it's co-regulation. It's quite, let's say, quite a risky idea, but from another side, while we have no, definitely we have no self-regulation and we have no basis for self-regulation at this historical moment, we decided that to at least to make a step for self-developing rules and self-using rules by media market, it's a good time to try. We are not idealists. We understand that a lot of risk about it, but it's better to try than not to try at all. Of course, we're trying to establish non-commercial media, which means that with the aim to support small medias, especially in regions when we have lack of local news, and especially after reform we made on privatization of state municipal print press. It's a good time also to help local initiatives to spread local news about themselves, not just live with all news from nationwide companies, which we have 28. It's the biggest number, I think, in Europe. Also, we have a new structure of sanctions. Both we established for simple mechanism when regulators, first of all, notifying and then using sanctions, except, of course, maybe the worst activities like already mentioned Medvedchuk channels made. But if you mistake, regulator first you need to notify you that you made a mistake. Please not continue operating such way. If you ignore this, then sanctions will be used. And also we have a new chapter related to Russian aggression. Yeah, if
2 minutes. 2 minutes.
It's the last point. We have separate chapter of the law about aggression because we can't establish all provisions about aggression like in the body of this law, but in special chapter, and we're trying to also find mechanism to protect ourselves because we see how this hybrid war works, and it works unfortunately not from 2013, but from 1993, I believe. And it works for many years in different ways, and we need to at least to decrease the level of such sanctions. And maybe asking a question you asked to previous participant, what we can ask. We need international cooperation in combating disinformation. We need international cooperation to tracing not only transparency of media ownership, which we established, but we need also transparency on financing, because as we saw, a lot of pro-Russian outlets financing through intermediaries, even in European Union. And it's not proper situation at all. And we need to establish international cooperation in this area, to not only to trace who is an owner, but also to trace where the money came from. Thank you.
Thank you, Ihor. And I propose to move to the Parliament perspective on the reforms. And today, Andriy Osachuk, who is a lawmaker and the Deputy Chair of the Parliament Committee on Law Enforcement, joined us. Andriy, you have heard about civil society perspective on the reforms, and would you agree with points our previous speakers mentioned? And what is your perspective? How do you observe the state of the anti-corruption reform, the media, and generally the law enforcement and generally democracy from the perspective of the Parliament? Andriy, your mic is turned off.
Yes, I'm back. Yeah, good morning and good afternoon once again. in fact, Olena Halushka provide you with all details, which we currently have on our agenda. But to be maybe more efficient in this dialogue, probably I will step above a little bit to give you some more like helicopter view picture on ongoing processes as I see it now. Look, first of all, probably I will tell even from some more insights. I think 2 months ago, just after New Year, I met one famous servant of people, soaps as we call them, in the corridors of the parliament, and we were talking about different things. And he knew that I have some contacts and keep dialogue with people from the United States, from European Union. So they treat me as an expert in international relations, which is good and which is true. And he asked me, Andrei, what do you think? Did Joe Biden administration had time and resources to work with Ukraine? Mostly because they have such a drama with COVID in the United States, such a lot of economical problems and so on and so forth. And we think that probably they will start doing something for Ukrainian agenda only in a year or so. I clapped his shoulder and said, my friend, don't worry, they will act and it will be fast. Meaning that from the very beginning, servants of people, they hope that Biden administration will be more busy with other things. But we were telling to many people in their team and to different institutions in Ukraine. In fact, it was said in the beginning of our discussion that it is unique time for Ukraine. It is not so unique for United States because I think that people in Alabama, they don't care that Joe Biden knows Ukraine well. But for Ukrainian society and for Ukrainian politicians, it's absolutely unique that the president of the United States knows by name a lot of people here in Kyiv and in Ukraine. He knows geographical name of Ukrainian citizens and villages, and not only all contacts of Ukraine and ongoing Ukrainian-Russian war. So that's why it's definitely a window of opportunity for us. And as someone already mentioned, we see a lot of different things happening within last month or so. Even today, for example, it was a very unusual capturing of one individual, one top manager from Privatbank. So he took a flight from Dnipropetrovsk by private jet. He was flying to Vienna, but he was stopped in the air by NABU, and he landed back in Borispol. And the officers from NABU, they issued him, as we call it, suspension. And it happens just 3 days after the report of General Prosecutor Office Irina Vindictova in Verkhovna Rada last Friday. And I was the guy who asked her a question, why she is not issuing suspensions on Privat case, because we have all evidences, all materials, why she is initiating different expertise and different other procedural things. And her answer was not really clear, and it was on Friday. And today they are acting, which is saying that the team of Vladimir Zelensky is trying to demonstrate its efficiency. So that's good. But I want to make a few steps back talking about the reforms. In fact, it was your question. Unfortunately, it's not common in Ukraine to talk about mistakes, and it's not common to talk about what was wrong with the reforms and with our cooperation with the West and even with the Western support. But I would put it on that way that starting from the 2014, we started a lot of things simultaneously. And many things was done absolutely good. And in reality, we are quite far comparing to where Ukraine was in early 2014, and a lot of huge and great things had happened, but still too many things were happening simultaneously. And any organization has so-called the management resource. And lack of management is a normal for any type of company or any type of organization. I had a big experience in business. Probably you heard I was working for 25 years as a top manager in a number of Ukrainian companies. Last 11 years, I was on the board of Kyiv Star, the largest mobile operator in Ukraine. And I was dealing with a lot of transformation which we had in our company, which was a huge company for Ukraine because we were serving 26 million customers in Ukraine. And I know what management capacity is. If you launch 25 projects simultaneously and you have just 2 heads and 1 head and 24 hours per day, sometimes it's difficult or almost impossible to finish everything in time. And I'm afraid the same happened in Ukraine. Because, for example, when we say that we need to protect anti-corruption infrastructure, always this phrase is pronounced in positive way. But, for example, we have ARMA, the Agency on Research and Management of the Assets, which is the part of anti-corruption infrastructure. And it's a nightmare what's happening in ARMA till today. And the parliament is working now on changing the law. We adopted in the first reading, and we're trying to, in fact, to change the fundamental logic of ARMA operation. And it is the part of infrastructure, or of anti-corruption infrastructure. I think one of the other mistakes which was done, and even today in our discussion, I think Olena and somebody else repeat this phrase on the equally important war with Russia and with the corruption. Yes, you all remember from where these words came from. It was a great speech of Joe Biden, at the time Vice President of the United States of America, in Verkhovna Rada in December 2015. And in fact, I think this phrase established the priority of Ukrainian authorities with the reforms, war with Russia and war with corruption. But I would probably say something not very popular. I think Joe was wrong. Joe was wrong for simple reason. If we lose war with Russia, all other initiatives has no matter at all. Meaning that the war with Russia, the strength of Ukrainian army, the potential of Ukrainian special forces, the military equipment, military training, and so on and so on, is absolutely fundamental as long as we have hot stage of war with Russia. With the war with corruption, we also have a problem. And in fact, it was pronounced by my good friend Olena early in this discussion. Because when we say that people want justice, people want fight with the corruption, in fact, I think 95% of Ukrainians, they want some fat, corrupt guy to be burned on stake in the center of Kyiv. And that's exactly the fight with corruption. Unfortunately, hunting on corrupt people accepted as a priority. And that's why we have so many noise around NABU, which, by the way, is doing absolutely great job. I'm not questioning at all the efficiency of NABU, and they really such a great guys that nobody likes them in this country. Nobody, probably except my party, Holos, likes NABU, meaning that they're doing probably a very good job. But I think that we lose some focus on prevention. Because fighting with corruption, it's not a hunt on corrupt people only, on corrupt top officials. It's a necessity to change the governance, to change the ethics in the state service, in local municipalities. And that's exactly probably the answer on your question on importance on anti-corruption strategy, which was recently approved by Rada in the first reading. It's for sure a very declarative document. So we shall not overestimate the importance of this strategy. I know that you spend a lot of time working with this, but it is very important that it is showing the way how to change the governance on the central and local level. And it is very important to be focused on execution. I had a personal experience before Verkhovna Rada. I spent 3.5 years being the member of Kyiv City Council, being the deputy of Kyiv City Council. And I had the same exercise there with anti-corruption strategy for Kyiv City, which was approved, I think, 2016 or something like that. And it was prepared also jointly with a big crowd of civil society organization. I personally was the guy who redrafted almost 50% of the document to make a structure with KPIs, with timings, and so on and so forth. But I know that nobody in the building of, we call it Khreshchatyk 36, was really interested in implementing this strategy. Meaning that execution is sometimes even more important than general declarative documents at all. That's why coming back to the war with corruption, we may see that huge number of initiatives which we had and ongoingly have, they face one huge wall, and this wall is courts. It is understood, but again, we shall to stress it, that no reason in paramount majority of initiatives if people go to court and receive a positive decision for that. In Kyiv Rada, we were able to create huge problems for almost 10 officials in Kyiv Rada. None of them had any penalty because all of them, they've got a positive decisions in the court. Sad that I think that we need to squeeze priorities as much as possible for today. We in Holos are working with this since the end of last year. We keep a lot of dialogues as internally as externally, and I'm very happy to see that, for example, when we opened the session of Rada 2 weeks ago, the chairman, Mr. Razumkov, said that the court reform is a priority. It was his statement. We see the statement from G7, I think a week ago, saying that, guys, court priority is fundamentally important. And it is true. Without judicial reform, we will not have investments, no jobs, no vaccines, so nothing will happen in this country. That's why I really ask everyone to try to be maximum focused on court reform, because we are talking on that almost 25 years. Recently on one meeting, I remember that in 1996, I was working as an assistant to Serhiy Holovate, at that moment, the Minister of Justice of Ukraine. And I remember I was helping him to make a presentation. I think he was going to the Council of Europe. And with this hand, I was typing, the heading of one article. And this heading has 2 words: law reform, court reform. Sorry, it was court reform, pravova reform. So meaning that since that time, yes, we moved a little bit, but the same issues is on our agenda. And a lot of enemies of Ukraine, they're always manipulating, like IMF is demanding something from you, you are stupid, but come on. It is not IMF demanding the courts reform or law, rule of law reform. It's what Ukraine promised to Ukrainian nation 25, 30 years ago, and what we promised our partners abroad during decades. And legal law enforcement, law reform, sorry, it's like I will put it in another way. The demand of IMF of law reform is the same like demand of the doctor for the guy, to make a test or to do something with medical, issues, because we are sick. We are sick, and it is for us, to make a treatment. So that's why I think fundamental issue for us is to be extremely focused. And the same on that is prioritization. Again, coming back to my point that we did so many things simultaneously, we need to be more prioritized. Again, without court reform, nothing will happen. Then we can go to law enforcement, and we shall not reinvent anything new, because for the last 7 years, we did a lot of good legislation. For example, I'm working with the police a little bit, and law on national police is quite okay. It's quite okay, and it exists for 5 years. The problem with execution. So that's why the focus from the West, when we're talking about support of Ukraine, shall be not on inventing something, new initiatives, new laws. No. Let's be focused on executions. Too many efforts have been already invested into different roadmaps, into different position papers, into the laws. We just need to execute all that. And the last comment, which I seldom hear in different audiences, but I think is very important, talking about Western support to Ukraine, I think we need to a little bit step out from Kyiv. Because everything what I'm hear from civil society organizations, everything what I hear on discussions like that is mostly about what's happening in Kyiv, what's happening in Grushevskovo Street, on Bankova Street, and how we, fight each other on different, by the way, sometimes very important issues. But I want to say that Ukraine is not Kyiv only. We moving with decentralization. Everyone a little bit sick probably with this word, but we're really moving, and we're really moving very well. We give a lot of authorities and powers to regions. We recently had the local elections, in the end of last year in new districts countrywide. And I think it's extremely important to provide help and assistance on the regional level. I recently traveled to the Western Ukraine. We went to, I think, 5 or 6 cities, small cities, and tomorrow I will fly to Kherson and will then travel to Odessa and to other cities in the south. And we see that local communities, they really require support. They really require any kind of support, starting from financing, finishing with consultancy, technical support, and so on and so forth. So that's why I think that we shall remember that Ukraine is thousands and thousands of small villages and cities where millions of Ukrainians are living, and mostly these very Ukrainians are losing hope, and these very people are going to Poland for work, going to Portugal for work, to Italy, and so on and so forth. So that's why I think this prioritization is extremely important. And coming back to Verkhovna Rada and these changes which we currently see during last 1 month of Joe Biden presidency, I think we need to understand that all decisions, unfortunately or fortunately, are making by Zelensky and his small circle of people. Yes, Mr. Razumkov has certain influence on the process. Mr. Shmyhal, as a prime minister, has even less influence because he is in fact representing the office of president in the cabinet of ministers. But it's bad, but from another side, it's good for the West, because again, it's one point, it's one window, for dialogue. Again, I don't think that we need to create something new. Just we need to be very clear with Zelensky and his people that everything what was promised shall be fulfilled. I hope that this dialogue is efficient, especially because of the latest events. And the last comment on all latest events, I mean on the Medvedchuk TV channels, on Shari and sanctions against Medvedchuk and his wife and other companies. One comment which is worrying me as a lawyer. Sanctions are an efficient way to stop enemy during the war. Yes, Ukraine was using sanctions even before against Ukrainian citizens when the citizens were on temporary occupied territories. Some terrorists in Donetsk and Lugansk, they were Ukrainian citizens. Definitely the Ukrainian law enforcement system was not able to catch them, and we introduced sanctions. with the sanctions against Medvedchuk and his colleague Kozak, I see a problem. Because these guys are walking around Kyiv, they are sitting in parliament, they're voting for laws, meaning that they're influencing the way how Ukrainian society is living. And at the same time, these guys are officially blamed with financing of terrorism. Said that, I think is dramatically important that Ukrainian law enforcement system, Security Service of Ukraine, police, State Bureau on investigation will do their domestic job, because it's important that all these guys who were sanctioned, I mean the guys who are the citizens of Ukraine, they shall be taken into responsibility through Ukrainian criminal code, through the tools of Ukrainian jurisdiction. And as faster we will do that, as better, because we shall not forget that Medvedchuk is a lawyer. He's a very smart guy in all legal things. All his team, the opposition platform, they're extremely professional in different legal tricks. And I'm afraid that after this brave beginning, which Zelensky did for the last 2 or 3 weeks, in 1 year, we all may have a problem if these guys will be able to succeed in the courts. So that's why I hope that everything which we witness in Ukraine in fighting with the Russian agents and pro-Russian politicians is just the beginning. And I wish a big success to Security Service of Ukraine. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrei. Thank you for your perspective and your perception of this process. And we have one more comment. Actually, it's not a secret that one of the major driving forces to provide reforms in Ukraine is civil society. And civil society constantly faces threats from parliament and from some members of parliament who are actually under the United States sanctions. It's very famous lawmakers, Derkach, and actually we have one more comment from Denisenko, who is an executive director of the RPR coalition, on several draft legislations which are registered in the parliament and which provide threat to civil society development. Denis, if you can briefly describe what international partners need to hear about this legislation and what this legislation is about. Thank you. Thank you. Then we'll move to Q&A session. All your questions here are not lost, and we're running out of time, but all the questions will be answered. Thank you, Denis. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Denis, for these possibilities and colleagues. So I'll try to be focused. So the public, as Denis said, the public activists and public organization remain the main drivers of reform in Ukraine. But in recent years, there is a dangerous tendency to weaken the role of civil society by trying to adopt the numbers of law, which Denis mentioned by the Verkhovna or other parliamentarians. During 2020, the Verkhovna Rada of Ukraine registered 12 bills that threatened civil society, violent the constitution and national obligation, because their equal advocacy to commercial lobbyism propose to illustrate those who come from the civil society sector, or introduce the concept of foreign agent, ban civil activists from holding protests near courts, introduce lie detector tests for civil activists, and etc. Most of these bills were not developed to regulate the activities of civil society, of course, organizations specifically, because they are related to other spheres. But some provisions in these documents directly or indirectly affect on the activities of the civil society organizations. In addition, some of these initiatives are synchronized with the discreditation campaign against the Sorosiata and the anti-Western rhetoric promoted by some political forces. I will focus on these bills about lobbyism, which Denis mentioned already. In February and March 2020, the Verkhovna Rada of Ukraine registered 4 bills on legal regulation of lobbyism and lobbying activities. Each of these 4 bills contain controversial norms for civil society, which pose a potential threat to the activities of activists and non-governmental organizations in general. So there are following problems in these bills, which we see. First of all, it's a lack of distinction between lobbying and civil society participations in public policy making. The danger of the broad use of terminology of advocacy by the concept of lobbyism lies in the fact that as a result of adopting the bills in their existing form, any advocacy activities campaign implemented by non-governmental organization will automatically be regulated as lobbying activists. Then introduction of additional reporting for civil society organization. Then unreasonable restriction on lobbying. Additional regulation for public organization. And of course, incorrect classification of type of public involvement. And introduction of penalties and possibilities of imposing penalties of civil society organization by decision of the regulator. Given the threats posed by these bills to limit human rights opportunities for citizens and civil society organization to participate in public policy making and developing civil society, we as RPR and actually the more broader coalition of NGOs calls the deputies of Ukraine to reject these bills and also ask the international partners to support us with these forces. Thank you, Denis. I will try to be short.
Thank you. And we finally can go ahead for a Q&A session. And Jonathan, could you please jump in?
I just want to jump in because I know we're getting close to a stop time and we're a little bit over right now. So we appreciate everybody staying, all of our speakers staying a little bit beyond time, and also those participating online. And there was, Andrei, you raised a number of really important issues. Also, the conversation on media, I do want to bring that back, but Denis, I thought maybe we could sort of wrap up everything in sort of final statements for each one of our speakers. But I did want to respond to Andrei just about the support on aggression and military support for Ukraine. I'm sure it was not lost on anybody that the Biden administration has been very clear, crystal clear about continued support, defensive support and military support for Ukraine. That couldn't have been said more times, clearer. And I think everybody gets the importance of that particular aspect of Ukraine's security, and the importance then to also carry out simultaneously the reforms that you talked about. The same reforms that you worked on, in the late 90s, and that I think, and I appreciate the word implementation, passage implementation, but execution of not only new laws but also these, the existing structures. So I just wanted to say thank you, because I think you are right. I think those are areas where there is going to be a great deal of focus, and it should be very clear what those priorities are. So thank you for doing that. But I just wanted to jump in just to point out that military and security support for Ukraine from the U.S., which I think couldn't have been clearer. Immediately coming in, the administration, this new administration in Washington, was very clear about its position on that issue. I can send it back. Denis, I don't know if you have an order in which you want folks to respond or to have final statements. And also, if my colleagues, I don't know if Orest or Bruno has anything that you want to add. Okay. But Denis, I'm going to send it back to you to coordinate the final responses.
Thanks. Therefore, I invite everybody to have 3 minutes final responses, and it would be great if these responses correlate with the questions. And basically, I guess we covered in your statements, you as speakers covered all essential questions we wanted discuss today. And basically, I would start with Andrea Sachuk, and then we'll go back to Igor and Vadim Miski. Just final statement to summarize what we discussed today from your perspective. Andrea, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I think the latest event shows how important cooperation of Ukraine with the United States and how cooperation with the United States make influence on changes in Ukraine. I think for the first month of the Biden presidency, Ukraine changed probably more than the United States. Said that, I personally had zero doubt that Joe Biden will be committed to everything what he said, even in his previous role of vice president, his role of candidate to the president of the United States, and now being the president of the United States. I totally believe that from his side, the Biden administration will do anything to support Ukraine, meaning that the ball is on our side. And as a politician, as a member of opposition party, I think we will do anything what we can, even with our limited resources and limited people, to shed the light on the problems, and mostly to prioritize the problems, as I said before, because it is absolutely dramatic to be focused. It was absolutely dramatic for the West to be focused with the help of, for Ukraine, because that's the only way how we may succeed. And only by joint and synchronized actions we may reach result. Said that, for the moment, I will repeat once again, we must focus on a law reform. Courts reform shall be a priority for everyone. If we will kill this animal in 2021, it will be probably the best success of Ukraine, of the West, and President Zelensky. Yes, I am an opponent to him, but I wish him and the servants of people also a success. And I am still optimistic, despite a lot of very negative things around, that it is possible. I mean, the court reforms is possible in 2021. Thank you.
Oh, I'm sorry, I'm muted. Thank you for your answer and for your final statement. Igor Skladai.
You know, I agree with Andrea Sachuk in one sense that we have a huge threat, for our presence as a country, as a nation. And that's why when we have reforms, and I also agree that we've made the mistakes, and even with anti-corruption, we've made the mistakes. And it's good time to think about them. By the way, we have a progress. Even reviewing some things in my area of media, I see we made a lot of steps. Yes, when you day by day working on them, you will not see them as you do some focus out or rise about the bees, and you see that we developing, we changing. And in this time, it's very important not to change the line, especially when you have a time of 50 colors of gray, when you have no white light, when you have no dark color, you have some gray. And you need to survive in this area, you need to cooperate, you need to find new mechanisms, because again, what our ancestors, or people who lived behind us, who develop standards on European Convention, I think they did not believe that such crazy times could appear. And if you read in Convention, it's developed from the way of peaceful time. But at this moment, we have quite like second Cold War, something like that. And we need, from one side, trying to protect and save all these developments for the last more than half a century. But from another side, we need to develop new instruments which will protect democracy per se, because unfortunately, autocratic states use mechanism or democratic mechanism to destroy democracy. And it's very important to remember about this and to find proper solution, not to become autocracy, like not to kill dragon became dragon from one side, but from another side, to have effective mechanism, not when you just saying go to court and fight for 3 years when your state will dismiss from during this time. And for us, it's very important to balance. It's very tiny line. It's really a risky line, but we need to find this balance. And especially in my case, it's area of media. For one side, to protect freedom of speech, but from another side, not to allow bad actors to play no bad game with normal rules. And that's my.
Thank you, Ihor, and thank you for mentioning that there are some positive steps, and definitely our discussion is here is I would say almost always is we're focusing more on the issues, on the problems, right? But we should not forget that Ukraine is developing. Its democracy is developing, definitely. And Vadymsky, your statement.
Thank you so much. I agree. Would like to agree with Andriy and his message that the judicial reform is very important for now, because it's the basement for the whole system of anti-corruption. And in the media sphere, such a reform, which is the basement for the media pluralism and freedom of speech, is the public broadcasting reform, because it only the public broadcasting is able to influence the media market, our oligarchic media market we have in Ukraine. The US government keeps it in focus, this reform, and next steps needed, just like to mention one more, the stable funding model for the public broadcasting and keeping its management independent during election of the new CEO. And also disinformation, as we understand, is a big threat. And here is very important to cooperate closely, especially into limit possibility to spread disinformation for such Russian influencers like Viktor Medvedchuk. Thank you.
Thank you, Vadim. And as we're running out of time, I guess, and I can summarize from my side that we had quite a constructive discussion today, and basically all the issues which are in priority, which are in the focus of civil society, were raised and were highlighted. And thanks to all the speakers who joined us, and thanks to everybody who listened to this webinar on the both sides of the Atlantic. And Jonathan, Orest, would you like something to add?
I can, let me just add on my end too. I just want to thank RPR, but also colleagues in Brussels, but especially our speakers today. You know, obviously the time doesn't do justice to the challenges that you're facing or the issues you're working on. You know, one thing we didn't talk about was today was Ukraine's Euro-Atlantic track integration with the EU, further integration with NATO. The democracy and judicial rule of law component are not only important to addressing the internal challenges, but also clearly a component and a prerequisite for integration. And so we'll continue to have these conversations. I know Dennis and RPR will be back next month with another upcoming virtual session as well, and more activities. But with that said, I just want to thank everybody, including those that pulled this event together. Our speakers, thank you so much. Elena's not here, but we'll be watching for everything that you're working on. And hopefully we can all use this moment right now as a springboard for more collective action together. And I heard what was said too about the challenges and threats facing civil society in Ukraine as well, and media, how important it is to ensure that Ukraine has a strong independent media and a strong civil society protected and able to work as a partner with the government. So with that said, that's all on my end. Just a big thank you and a good rest of your day to everybody else. And Oris, do you have anything you wanted to add? Okay. Bruno? I think he might be off here. Bruno, any last? Okay. Dennis, with that last word, thank you again. And we look forward to our next conversation. Thank you to everybody for joining.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Goodbye.